Welcome to a Friday night edition of Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
Michael, extraordinarily well. It's lovely to see you. I do love our Friday get-togethers.
We've got an incredibly varied show tonight, I have to say. So we're going to be talking about the owner of GB News and his potentially religious motivations. I'll be interviewing the Green Party's candidate for the London mayoral race. That will be live. And we are also going to talk about those quite incredible protests in the United States. As I know we've been talking about it all week, but there were some arrests and some scenes from last night that really were quite incredible. Amid ongoing tensions between the world's two superpowers, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping in Beijing. In the meeting, President Xi warned that the two countries must not engage in what he called vicious competition. He also told Blinken that the US and China should be partners, not rivals, and that they should seek mutual success. According to Chinese state media, he added, quote, "China is pleased to see a confident, open, prosperous United States. We hope that the US can also view China's development in a positive and proactive light." Speaking after the meeting, Antony Blinken celebrated joint efforts between the United States and China to control the global supply of fentanyl, and sort of control as in restrain it, not sort of make a cartel, and agreement for future cooperation on artificial intelligence. But he also raised some disagreements.
In my discussions today, I reiterated our serious concern about the PRC providing components that are powering Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. China is the top supplier of machine tools, microelectronics, nitrocellulose, which is critical to making munitions and rocket propellants, and other dual-use items that Moscow is using to ramp up its defense industrial base. A defense industrial base that is churning out rockets, drones, tanks, and other weapons that President Putin is using to invade a sovereign country, to demolish its power grid and other civilian infrastructure, to kill innocent children, women, and men. Russia would struggle to sustain its assault on Ukraine without China's support. In my meetings with NATO allies earlier this month, and with our G7 partners just last week, I heard that same message. Fueling Russia's defense industrial base not only threatens Ukrainian security, it threatens European security. Beijing cannot achieve better relations with Europe while supporting the greatest threat to European security since the end of the Cold War. As we told China for some time, ensuring transatlantic security is a core U.S. interest. In our discussions today, I made clear that if China does not address this problem, we will.
So I thought this was a bit rich, right? Antony Blinken has gone to Beijing and saying, the problem with you guys, China, is you are helping a country which is killing women and children and innocent people. It seems as if the Chinese aren't really arming them with weapons. He's talking about sort of dual-use industrial kit. So the Chinese are exporting things to Russia which could be used to produce weapons, so not necessarily weapons. So the US say, this is really, really bad. You can't sort of expect to work with the United States and Europe properly while you're still sort of arming this aggressor. Well, that is, of course, the same United States that has been arming Israel while they have killed a hell of a lot more women and children, actually, than the Russians have in Ukraine. The total death toll in Ukraine is much higher because there's been so many military deaths. And as I always say, I think those military deaths are the fault of the Russians. It's not sort of legitimate because they've only killed Ukrainian soldiers. If they've killed Ukrainian soldiers because they invaded Ukraine, that's very bad. They shouldn't have done that. I also, would prefer the Chinese not to be exporting stuff to Russia, which can be used to fight this war. But one person who cannot go to China and say that, with a straight face, is the Secretary of State for the United States, who have been at the UN vetoing anything to try and hold the Israelis to account and are the key armor. They're not sending Israel dual-use stuff. They're sending Israel the literal bombs, which they are dropping on innocent people. Aaron, we're going to look at a bit more of what sort of Antony Blinken said in a moment. First of all, can I get your comments sort of on the Americans going to China and lecturing them on providing dual-use industrial goods to the Russians?
The big problem here for the United States, Michael, is that China's exports to Russia allow its civilian economy to take over quite well. That's the main problem, from consumer durables to being able to maintain a domestic infrastructure with regards to cars, aviation. Russia obviously produces a hell of a lot of that stuff itself. but it also has to import a hell of a lot of stuff as well from China. And that's one of the major differences now to say 30, 40 years ago. If you wanted to impose sanctions on a major economy 30, 40 years ago, let's say just after the end of the Cold War, they would be very successful. As we saw with Iraq, by the way, in the early 1990s. There was one point in the early 1990s, Michael, where Iraq couldn't import baby food because the US State Department said that adults might eat it. They couldn't import ping pong balls. They couldn't import shrouds in order to bury people, as is commensurate with practice in Islam. That's what you do. Use cotton shrouds. They couldn't import those things. If you wanted to export something, if you wanted to send something from Iraq to the UK, if a grandmother knitted something and sent it to the UK, you needed an import license. So the whole point of those sanctions was not to hurt Saddam. It was to completely crucify the domestic civilian economy and hope magically there would be some kind of uprising. My view on sanctions is actually they are the worst possible tool 9 times out of 10. Everybody talks about South Africa, talk about every other case where they simply don't work. They very rarely lead to productive or useful regime change either. They certainly solidified Saddam's position in Iraq in the 1990s. So what they're trying with Russia is something moderately similar in so much as is possible. Obviously, it's a much larger economy with a much larger domestic industrial base. But the point of these sanctions is to hurt the average Russian, to bring down the quality of their living, make them feel the pinch. And that simply hasn't really been the case. In fact, we know that after a somewhat surprisingly small downturn in the Russian economy after the invasion, there was a downturn, but it wasn't as big as people were saying. There's actually been an uptick. And I think this year, Russia is predicted to grow at a faster pace. And I think any G7 economy, that doesn't mean Russia's some economic success story. What it does mean is that these sanctions haven't bitten like they hoped. And one major reason why is that China is still continuing its commercial relations with its neighbor. That's what this is all about. It's not about China helping Russia's war effort. If there's one thing actually Russia is relatively self-sufficient in, it's armaments, things like shells. Still imports things like drones from Iran, ballistic missiles from North Korea to some extent, but it's pretty good at making those things itself. On high-end consumer electronics, other things too, yes, it needs China.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I do take that point because on sanctions with Russia, I feel sort of two ways about it, because I do think that Russia's war was a war crime on Ukraine. It was an act of aggression. I mean, whether or not you argue that it was somewhat provoked, I mean, to go into Ukraine in that way, I think should be, opposed in the strongest possible terms. And then it's just but I do take your point about the sort of practical debate. Do sanctions work in the way that they are supposed to? Are we maybe just sort of imposing them to make ourselves feel better? That's potentially beyond my pay grade. I'm not really sure what I think about that, but I do take your points very seriously there. And let's move on to a different topic between US-China or within US-China relations, because Antony Blinken had other complaints about China.
I also expressed our concern about the PRC's unfair trade practices and the potential consequences of industrial overcapacity for global and U.S. markets, especially in a number of key industries that will drive the 21st century economy, like solar panels, electric vehicles, and the batteries that power them. China alone is producing more than 100% of global demand for these products, flooding markets, undermining competition, putting at risk livelihoods and businesses around the world. Now, this is a movie that we've seen before, and we know how it ends, with American businesses shuttered and American jobs lost.
So, Aaron, I mean, this one to me seems like a particularly odd complaint. Like big bad China, you're producing too many solar panels and electric cars. Like if I hear a country is flooding the global market with solar panels and electric cars, I mean, my immediate reaction is to say, brilliant, but maybe I'm being economically naive. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, isn't it funny, Michael? In the early 1990s, the US government had absolutely no problems with the Chinese flooding the market with cheap consumer durables like electronic goods or whatever, everything basically. China became the workshop of the world after the end of the Cold War. They had no problem with them flooding the market with these things, because what it meant was that inflation stayed down. You didn't have to pay your workers so much. So China's been flooding Western markets with their consumer goods for a very long time. The point is, because they've moved up the commodity chain, they're now producing very strategically valuable stuff. It's become a problem for the US. It's not new that China is manufacturing stuff at huge scale, not surprising, 1.3 billion people, and it's capturing massive parts of the global market. That's been the case for many, many things for what, more than 20 years. It's now becoming the case in, yes, electric vehicles, photovoltaic cells, so many more things too, but also things like steel. Chinese steel production is just enormous, and it's really killing steel production in much of the rest of the world. But I find it funny almost, on the one hand, for Blinken to say, Janet Yellen said the same thing too, to say, you're dumping these things on our markets. 5-10 years ago, it would have been a strange complaint to say, you're dumping cheap photovoltaic cells, cheap solar energy onto our domestic market. You're dumping. When I think of dumping, Michael, I think of toxic wastes, okay? I think of refuse. I think of garbage. I don't think of a car, as we've seen with the Chinese recently producing a wonderful car that looks like a Porsche. It's going to retail in the low $20,000 range. It has I think a 700 kilometer range in terms of the battery. I don't associate something that looks like a Porsche Taycan for a quarter of the price with a better range than any Tesla model. That's not something you dump. I think the American consumer would quite like that, actually. And that's the problem. You're seeing in sector after sector, actually, the Chinese are producing better products at a better price than what the US is able to do. And this is a major problem because, of course, the EV, electric vehicles, will completely capture the vehicle automotive market globally over the next 10, 20, 30 years. That's going to happen. And the concern is that just as China, grabbed all that cheap crap you see on Amazon China makes, the American worry is that, oh my God, all the really important crap that everybody also likes having, from computers to mobile phones to cars, that will also be made in China. Major problem. And then finally, Michael, I find this fascinating. What's been a major political issue across the West, across the world really, but across the West over the last several years? What's the major political issue? Inflation, high prices. The consumer is being hit by high prices, and we can talk about why those prices were rising, why inflation went up. You might say QE over the last 15 years. You might say COVID. You might say energy shocks because of the Russia war. You might say because of bad monetary policy by the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England. You might say all of it. It doesn't matter. It's happened, and it's generally viewed as bad for the consumer, high inflation. And here's China saying, well, look, we're offering cheap steel, cheap cars, cheap energy. And by the way, it's renewable too. But suddenly this is bad. So inflation is bad, but also dumping these things is also bad. There's a big inconsistency here, Michael. I think, frankly, this is the United States tacitly admitting it can no longer do capitalism and global exports, particularly of high-value goods, as well as the Chinese.
I mean, the dumping issue. So I remember when I was doing A-level economics, so back in the late noughties, dumping was something that was talked about, and it was talked about in the context of the Europeans and the Americans subsidizing their farmers, and then sort of excess grain being exported at very low prices to Africa. And again, you sort of have your sort of initial thing would be, great, how can you complain about sending grain to Africa? But the complaint was that it meant that they couldn't build up their own domestic industries because they were outcompeted by these sort of subsidized European and American industries. Was farming, isn't it? I suppose it's industrial farming, so it is an industry. But the key difference there is that that was less a critique about sort of exporting grain and more a critique about enforcing free trade regimes on countries in the global south who weren't necessarily ready for free trade because they needed sort of to give their own industries a chance. And Danny Roderick tweeted today, so he's sort of one of the leading theorists of globalization, an economist at Harvard Kennedy School. So like big deal guy. He was saying, I don't get this because, this sort of fear mongering about China flooding the market, because he's saying, we don't live in a free trade world anymore. And what's bizarre about Antony Blinken going to Beijing and complaining about them producing all these electric cars is China hasn't exported a single electric car to the United States because they've got really huge tariffs on them. So it seems, America has done really poorly when it comes to electric cars. Their rollout is tiny. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Sort of the amount of electric cars that they're rolling out in the Chinese market is huge. The amount they're rolling out in the American market, tiny. But that's got nothing to do with Chinese car producers. That's got to do with the Americans not having their taxation system correct. So I could see how you'd complain about dumping if China were forcing America to keep their borders open to Chinese cars, but they haven't exported a single car to America. It just seems somewhat odd to me. And Danny Roderick agrees. I trust his opinion on this one. And let's end this segment on a lighter note. Joe Biden this week hasn't assuaged fears he's too old for the role of president.
Imagine what we can do next. 4 more years. Pause. 4 more years. 4 more years. 4 more years.
I mean, that's really, that might be the fault of like one of his assistants, because if it says 4 more years pause, like the pause really needs to be in square brackets or something which really signals to this older gentleman that he's not supposed to read 4 more years pause. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is standing trial in New York for not declaring the hush money he paid to a porn star. And he's also showing signs of aging. This was from a New York Times live blog last week. Trump appears to have fallen asleep in court again. It happened several times just now. His eyes were closed for extended periods and his head dropped down twice. But if sleeping in the dock may show signs of Donald Trump's old age, his social media posts show he still has the humor of a pretty sharp teenage boy. His former Attorney General, Bill Barr, who had been critical of Trump this week, said he would still vote for the Republican candidate. In response, Trump said this: "Wow, former AG Bill Barr, who let a lot of great people down by not investigating voter fraud in our country, has just endorsed me for president, despite the fact that I called him weak, slow-moving, lethargic, gutless, and lazy. Based on the fact that I greatly appreciated his wholehearted endorsement, I am removing the word lethargic from my statement. Thank you, Bill." MAGA 2024. So he's still weak, slow-moving, gutless, and lazy. Aaron, 2 in-ideal candidates. I mean, obviously, I would prefer Joe Biden to get re-elected, but I suppose because we're talking about US-China relations, if you're a Chinese sort of propagandist and you want to argue that your system is just as good as the Americans, there probably is no better asset that you have than Joe Biden versus Donald Trump this November.
Well, the entire US political class. I mean, literally all of them. I think about a third or maybe a half. No, I think it's about half of the House of Representatives are over the age of 65. There is clearly an issue of gerontocracy in American politics. You know, that is a country where a median age is around 40. It's around the same as the UK. And yet it has a significantly older political class. And obviously we can have a debate as to why, but that's just the facts. And Trump and Biden are an expression of that. So I think Joe Biden is the oldest person to ever be elected as president of the United States. The previous incumbent for that accolade was Donald Trump. And I think if Donald Trump wins, I think this year, I think he'll be older than when Biden won 4 years ago. I don't know. I think so. So, yeah, it's like you say, it's not exactly an advert for American democracy. Although I must say, Michael, I am a bit reticent. When the New York Times, let's be honest, they've not been the fairest in covering Trump. You know, he might just have closed his eyes to listen or something, and they say he's fallen asleep. I mean, I don't know. So if there was evidence of it, then fine. But I have to say, he often sounds far more alert than Biden. He's had lots of gaps and lots of goofs. I mean, he's an older man as well, and I think that's inevitable. But I think you certainly can't compare them, Michael. The 4 more years pause thing. Michael, look, I can't wait. I can't wait for this presidential race. It's going to be absolutely crazy. And in terms of their positions on China, let's be real, because that's not something that's often talked about with regards to these men. It's about their personalities. It's about how they present themselves in the media. But on the substance of their policy positions on China, they're identical. Biden has continued and intensified the measures originally brought in by Trump in regards to Chinese exports, in regards to what he was doing on 5G with China. You know, the CHIPS Act, which is Biden's effort to reindustrialize the US with regards to microprocessors, create greater levels of technological autonomy, make Intel, you know, the world leader in microprocessors, chips. Good luck. It won't be. That's all been accompanied by Trumpian, quote unquote, positions on trying to strangle the growing Chinese microprocessor industry. Of course, most microprocessors right now, the really powerful ones, the really, really tiny ones, most of those are manufactured in Taiwan. So look, it's going to be a fascinating several months. But even as somebody who, yes, I prefer Biden to win, I don't think he's great. We'll have more stories later on the show as to why he's not great. But I obviously prefer him on things like climate. I think he's much better for US workers than Trump. we also have to be real. I think Biden really is in a class of his own when it comes to literally being asleep at the wheel. That is not a metaphor.
Next week, London goes to the polls to elect its mayor. The incumbent Labour mayor, Sadiq Khan, is the favourite to win, and he's put out a new campaign video today.
This is the greatest city in the world, and every day I wake up determined to do more.
Free school meals have been wonderful. It's been nice for my daughter to be able to sit down and have lunch with her friends and not to feel there's a difference between them.
Freezing TfL fares when we need it.
Delivering more police officers.
More affordable homes is amazing.
I'm a dad, so air quality is really important to me.
The transport is easy.
Hopper bus fare, the night tube and the Superloop, the Elizabeth Train.
This mayoral election is going to be close between Labour and the Tories. Their choice is clear. A Tory candidate who will force our city backwards, or a Labour mayor who will continue to move us forward.
There's so much more to do.
The boss man is never satisfied.
Now let's go even further for you and our city. If you give me your vote, I'll keep TfL fares down, build more homes for Londoners, bear down on crime, lift young Londoners up, end rough sleeping, lead the way on climate action, and deliver free school meals.
Jab, jab. Excellent.
Well, just imagine a Labour mayor with a Labour government working together. It'd be a game changer, it really would. Vote Labour.
Vote for Sadiq.
Vote for a London for everyone.
So we haven't managed to get Sadiq onto Novara yet to discuss his pitch, though I understand discussions are underway. Someone who I'm very grateful has agreed to come on the show, though, is his opponent from the Green Party, Zoe Garbett. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin with, why do you think people should vote for you instead of Sadiq?
Thanks for having me on, Michael. It's great to be here and to share our ideas as a Green Party. So I'm a councillor, a renter, a health worker, and for all those reasons, I'm running to be the Mayor of London. And I've been really speaking about making the city more affordable, going much further than the current mayor. So that's extending free school meals to secondary school children. It's really bringing in and extending free travel for young people on the bus. I've also been talking about buying back properties so we can acquire new homes more quickly, to provide people with council properties, and just really listening to Londoners and responding to the concerns and issues I've been hearing.
So what's the economic pitch behind it? Because lots of that does sound like it's going to cost money. Is it? I suppose as a mayoral candidate, you can't say we're going to pay for it by taxing the rich, because you don't have those powers. I mean, how would you deliver what you're promising?
Absolutely. So there's the mayor's budget is huge. It's about 20 to 22 billion pounds. So all of this is fully costed in our manifesto against the mayor's budget. We've also got some exciting proposals in our manifesto where we're raising funds to spend on things. So things like we've proposed a license, so taking some profits out of big, massive venues like the O2 and creating a fund for grassroots venues. I've got a background of working in the NHS, managing multi-million-pound budgets. So lots of this comes with my experience of that work as well.
Let's talk about one specific issue, so housing and Khan's record, actually, because I was looking through the Greater London Authority's housing report today. And this is the stat that made me sort of most inclined to say, oh, Sadiq Khan, maybe he's done a decent job. So between 2012 and 2016, when Boris Johnson was mayor, the Greater London Authority helped fund under 10,000 affordable homes every year, and virtually zero of them were council homes or social rent. So a lot of them wouldn't have actually been affordable. They've been like 80% of market rent or whatever. Now, apart from during the pandemic, that increased every year after Sadiq was elected. And last year, the GLA helped fund 25,000 affordable homes, of which over 15,000 were for social rent. So I suppose my question to you, do you sort of recognise that as a real achievement? And how would you do better on that?
So Greens in City Hall have really pushed and challenged the definition of affordable. I think you alluded to it there, that the definition currently from City Hall still includes things like shared ownership, which we know is really out of reach for the average Londoner. So we're really talking about acquiring and providing more council homes. So I want to see the London Plan, which is the key planning document that the mayor has, ask for a higher percentage from developers and hold developers to account to deliver on that percentage of more council homes. We know that not doing that and having more luxury homes built in areas really gentrifies and changes areas. I'm here in Hackney, and I hear and see that here from residents. And it's also the Greens in City Hall have really pushed the mayor to acquire existing homes. So that's properties that already exist, councils being able to buy those and to convert them back into council properties is quicker. You often get bigger homes, and it's just getting people off those council waiting lists a lot quicker.
And so I was looking at your sort of manifesto, and on housing, it does seem to be that sort of buying up existing private rental stock and bringing it into the council sector or the public sector is your key sort of pledge. You've also got rent controls. Do you also think that London needs a lot more housing? Do we still need to build a lot more houses than we currently have already?
I think the priority needs to be building the right homes at the right price in the right place. That's our green commitment. And definitely, as I've described, making sure that we get more and more council properties from anything that's built. Building is always part of the housing solution. We need more council properties, but it's making sure that we're maximising those council properties in any developments.
But I suppose I want to get an idea. Would you because people will see that there is, buildings have been going up in London. I actually personally think we need to build more. I think that, the population has gone up by 28% since 2000. Housing's only gone up by 20%. So I think there is a deficit of housing in London. And I suppose I want to get a sense from you. Would your inclination be to speed up building or to slow it down?
I think it's all about just getting the right homes. I think, obviously, I said here in Hackney, we've seen mass development and it's really changed areas. So to the point where lots of people who have lived here and grown up here can't afford the properties that are going onto the market. So I do think that we need more properties. But as I've said, I think it's a real priority to, the next mayor of London needs to put a case forward to government to get the money we need to build the homes. And it's just making sure that those homes are the right ones and absolutely needs to be genuinely affordable, which is council.
But if we're talking sort of total number of homes, your inclination would be to speed up the building of that total number of homes as opposed to slowing it down.
Yeah, but like I said, it needs to be the right homes and at the right price and in consultation with communities to make sure that, that they're adding to the areas and you're taking in all other things like the climate emergency and everything else into your plans.
Sure.
I wouldn't want to rig leg on some of those commitments.
Let's talk about policing. You've come under quite a lot of scrutiny this week for a pledge to have a target of 0 murders by 2030 in a city of 8 million people. Is that really a sensible ambition?
So I'm sure everyone agrees that any murder is an absolute tragedy. And we've seen, about 112 murders were counted in 2020 to 2023 that year. But I know that we need to zoom out and really think about those individual cases. And I'm sure that people listening have had a traumatic connection, in their family or immediate or in their communities where they've experienced a murder. I was on a police ride along where they had to respond to the murder and stabbing of a woman in my community, which was incredibly distressing. I obviously stayed in the car, but it was really quite traumatizing being so close to something so tragic. And I think, I think that one murder wasn't inevitable. And I think if you start thinking that one murder isn't inevitable and you zoom out and look at the reasons for murders, things like the lack of public services, lack of hope for young people, a number of other kind of national policies, which I think the Mayor of London needs to be campaigning to change, things like our drug laws. And if you start really putting the evidence forward to change those things, I think you start to see that it's an achievable goal. And I think it's something we should be aiming towards so that all our policies start to push in that direction.
Yeah, so suppose I want to focus, because it's easy to say, everyone would like the target to be 0, right? I'd like 0 bad breakups in the life of myself and all of my friends. I can't sort of pledge it's going to happen. And I think on this sort of 0 murders in London, I do struggle to take it seriously, I think. And one reason, you were caught up or held up on this sort of on LBC recently. Your colleague, Zach Polanski, so he's one of the Assembly members, sort of posted on Twitter, this can be done. It was done in this city in the United States. Then the article linked to, the city had 28,000 people living in it. It's 300 times smaller than London, with an average income of sort of 100,000. So you've got pretty much, I think, a lot of wealthy tech workers in this very, very small town. And you're saying, well, if they can do it, we can do it. And I suppose it does maybe open you up to the idea that you haven't really thought this one through.
I think we have thought it through. And obviously our whole manifesto is packed with ideas that really push in this direction. So things about youth services and job opportunities, some of the things in that case study show that things like residents trusting the police help to identify and address murders and prevent murders. So it's things like, yes, it's a small pilot example, but we know, and I know from working in the NHS and some of the work that I've had to do there, you do look to where people have had success and try and scale it up and learn those lessons. And I think we do know here that young people don't trust the police and wouldn't be talking to them to try and prevent any crime in their area. They kind of look to, solve that in their own ways. And I think we can learn that providing people with job opportunities, investing in youth services, really tackling kind of racism. We know that murders in our city are disproportionately affecting young Black people. And that's an inequality that I'm not willing to accept. And I really want to take tackling domestic violence incredibly seriously too. We know that the Met currently doesn't log if a crime against a woman is made worse by misogyny, so the hatred of women. And I think this is where all our policies start to then push in that direction.
And let's talk about the competition, I suppose. First of all, actually, are you worried about splitting the vote? And the context here for our audience, which I think is unfortunate for you. I think this was a bad move. So, not by you, by the way. So voting for the London mayor used to be the case that you got a first choice and you got a second choice. And that meant that you could sort of say, oh, well, I really don't want the Tories to get in, but I do quite like the Greens. So I'm going to vote Greens one. I'm going to vote Sadiq Khan second. And you could sort of confidently vote for a smaller party without handing the election to the Conservatives. Now, I think in a cynical move, the Conservative government changed the rules. So now you only get one vote. And so I imagine you're, like me, opposed to this. But given that is the reality, are you concerned that sort of by asking people to vote for you, the only really realistic outcome for that is that Susan Hall gets into office?
So, yeah, I am like you. I'm really disappointed in this backward step in democracy, but I'm not going to wait in the wings until our election system changes. We stand boldly on Green policies, and we are really excited about this election, and people get to vote Green on all three ballots, so for the Assembly as well. And I think, there have been some kind of scare tactics from the other parties, and I think this should be about people's track record and about their vision, and voters will decide who's the best person to lead the city.
I mean, I suppose you say scare tactics. And again, I'm saying this in a sort of, I'm trying to say this with sympathy because I know it's a difficult situation that the electoral system has put you in. But when the Labour Party say a vote for Greens could help Susan Hall get into office, I mean, that is true, isn't it? I mean, it's unfortunate that it's true, but it is true. And I suppose, how do you deal with that? How do you respond to that?
Well, I would spin that and say, a vote for the Greens is because people want to see the progressive policies that we're putting forward. And that's what the other parties should be responding to. I feel like the Conservative campaigners kind of given up. We're not really seeing them as much. They've kind of, stepped away from the press, not putting themselves forward for scrutiny. And we're really fighting for this campaign. We're really speaking to Londoners and getting out and about. I've participated in all the hustings. And I think it's a real opportunity for people to hear the kind of policies that Londoners want to see.
And can we end? I want to get your thoughts on Susan Hall. We've shown some videos of her on sort of recent shows, and whether you think the sort of poor quality of the Conservative candidate means that you could come second. Do you see that as a realistic possibility?
I think there's been some troubling stuff coming out of the Conservative Party, presenting kind of division and hatred and kind of U-turns on some of their policies, which have been really inconsistent. I think if Londoners want a Green mayor, they should vote for the Greens. And I'm really excited to see the support that we get. But yeah, you get those three ballots and we want to see more Greens in the Assembly too. But yeah, we'd love to, do as well as possible in this election.
Zoe Garbett, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, if Sadiq Khan is watching, you've got an open invite to come on the show next week. But yeah, we really do appreciate you coming on to speak to us. So thank you so much for that. Anti-war protests are continuing to spread across US college campuses. Encampments to protest the war on Gaza have so far been set up at over 40 universities across the country, and at 12 of them, including Columbia, the University of Southern California, Princeton, and Yale, the police have made arrests. And the repression by police has remained pretty intense. These were scenes from Ohio State University last night.
Media.
Just for sort of standing on a lawn outside a university. I mean, it seems pretty bizarre. It's not just students who are being sort of arrested, though. Take a look at this video from Emory University in Atlanta.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do for you right now?
Yes, can you call the philosophy department office and tell them I've been requested?
Philosophy department?
Yes, call the philosophy department office.
I will. What's your...
Noel McAfee, I'm chair of the philosophy department.
I got you.
President-elect.
Yes, you heard that right. The cops were arresting the chair of the university's philosophy department. She's called Noel McAfee. One of her colleagues got even rougher treatment. This is what happened when economics professor Caroline Folin questioned a police officer arresting a student.
Get on the ground, I said! Oh my God! You're a rabid dog! Oh my God! Give me some cops!
My head!
Hit that trooper head!
You just hit my head! On the concrete!
Oh my God! Oh my God! You people are fascists! You are Hitler! You are a rabid dog! Shame on you! May you never live another day!
I am a professor!
This is every professor, everyone!
I am a professor of economics!
You are rabid dogs! You are fascists!
It was a peaceful protest until they started fighting troopers. I agree with you.
L-I-N! I reacted impulsively. I apologize.
No, you're right. It's my turn now. I'm gonna share this.
Please remove the handcuffs.
And so apparently no police officer has been sort of disciplined for that, but the professor in question has been charged with battery. I think because I think she might have tapped the police officer to try and get their attention when they were arresting potentially one of her students, but a student at the university. And Aaron, these scenes are incredible. I'm wondering, well, it's a stupid question, but why? Who thinks this is to their benefit, right? If you want to clamp down on pro-Palestinian protest, I really do think that sort of wrestling a female economics professor to the ground is probably not the best way of sort of getting these protests under control. You know, I'm speaking here, if you were coming from a sort of pro-Zionist perspective, this just seems like a recipe for really multiplying the power of this movement.
Yeah, you're bringing US civil society into disrepute. And look, no sensible, thoughtful, even centre-right American thinks that's a price worth paying for a foreign country. They don't. The reason why there's been uncritical support for Israel, I'm not talking about the evangelical right, I'm talking about the US establishment. The reason why there's been uncritical support for Israel for decades is because there's no domestic downside for the US. There wasn't a big constituency of pro-Palestine voters. There wasn't this kind of activism. There wasn't this groundswell of support for Palestine, particularly among more progressive sections of the US elite. Just simply wasn't the case. That's now changed. I also found it pretty astonishing, Michael, that image of Noel McAfee, she's the chair of philosophy at that university. She was being arrested by a masked police officer. I find that an utterly extraordinary image. And I know this might sound predictable for me saying it, but imagine if you saw that image of a philosophy professor being arrested in Iran, Russia, China by a masked police officer. Major questions would be asked. And that's not whataboutery. This is somebody exercising a democratic right to protest over a perfectly legitimate foreign policy issue. They're very, their status would say that they should be treated with a certain kind of respect. If you think that the US state is punitive, racist, all those things, yes, then this shouldn't be happening. So it's almost like if you were China and you were like, or Russia or Iran, and you were trying to depict the United States as falling short of all the values it claims to uphold, whether that's with regards to foreign policy, we believe in rule of law, we believe in multilateral institutions, we're against war crimes, collective punishment, freedom of the press, all these things. Clearly, that's all being violated by Israel in Gaza. So it undermines your credentials in that regard abroad. And then you're doing something very similar at home, land of the free, you can protest here, it's fine. They're undermining that domestically in a very muscular, strange, ultimately counterproductive way. I saw one take, Michael, which I just find very annoying. Seemingly somebody on the left saying, isn't it funny how she says, I'm a professor, as in she's not used to it, she's privileged, like some woke argument for police authoritarianism. No, it's precisely when that sort of thing happens where people sit up and they go, okay, this is a bit strange. You know, your opinion writer at the Financial Times, your columnist at the Wall Street Journal, your feature writer at the Economist magazine, your investment banker, whoever. Okay, these people don't matter more than working class Americans, but clearly in terms of shaping the public debate, yes, they do. Let's be honest. They write the newspapers, they make the investment decisions, they draft the policy. Those people will look at that and think, hold on a second, those are my people. Those are people that look like me or my friends. What's going on here? This is not appropriate. So there's going to be a huge political blowback as a result of this. And Michael, finally, this is happening under President Joe Biden. If this was happening under President Donald J. Trump, everybody in Britain on the sort of the liberal media, James O'Brien at LBC, Paul Mason on Twitter, all the call-ins, BBC Newsnight, everybody, The World and Its Wife, the Newsagents podcast, Alistair Campbell's podcast. This is fascism. This is why Trump has to go. This is why we need a huge cross-class alliance to get Trump out. He's an authoritarian. He's a threat to democracy. But when Biden's in the White House and this kind of stuff is happening, tumbleweed, nothing. Nada. And I think that's a problem for Biden, of course, going into the elections. I think they will be tight. I think they will be tight in November. But it's a problem for him because if you're saying, I am the one that's defending democracy, I am the one upholding the rule of law, this one is a threat to all those things, and you've been president while college professors are being arrested on campus by masked police officers, it rather undermines your argument.
Well, it's always difficult to say with hypotheticals that definitely would have happened. But I mean, it definitely would have happened. I mean, if Trump had been in power, people would be calling this fascism, right? But because it's Joe Biden, they don't. We've got one more clip for you, actually. This is also from Emory University in Atlanta. So that appears to be a protester being tased in the leg while he is, or while he or she, I think it's a he, while they are sort of have their hands tied behind their back, handcuffed behind their back and lying on the floor. Now, I've never seen a taser sort of used at, point blank like that. But it looks like they're being tased. And this is just completely shocking. This is not the kind of thing, by the way, which is going to deter people from protesting. This is just going to really make a lot more people want to get involved. I think these protests could get a lot bigger over the coming days and weeks. We, of course, will be coming back to report them. I also saw actually that there was an occupation starting up at Warwick University here as well. I saw some tweets sort of saying, why aren't there these sort of things in the UK? There have been a lot of actions for Palestine at UK universities, and obviously these sort of weekly demonstrations in central London. I do have to say, I think the big variable here was just the police overreaction in America. If say, for example, not that we should hope that there's an overreaction against UK protesters, but I imagine if, the people camping at Warwick, if there was a case where people peacefully camping out for Palestine, riot police came in and arrested them all, that would be the one thing that the state could do to make sure that a pro-Palestine campus movement got absolutely massive. So if you are a Zionist in the United States, this seems like a real misstep to me. I've seen a lot of Tory MPs looking clueless, but not many moments top this. Chris Philp is the policing minister, and he was asked this question about the Rwanda plan on Question Time.
What's his name, Chris?
This is Chris, yeah.
Yeah, Chris.
Chris Philp.
I come from a neighbouring country called Congo, if you know geographically, that is located right next door to Rwanda. And right now in Goma, there's a genocide going on, and there's such a big conflict going on with people from Rwanda. So had my family members come from Goma on a crossing right now, would they then be sent back to the country that they're supposedly warring, Rwanda? Does that make any sense to you?
No, I think there's an exclusion on people from Rwanda being sent to Rwanda.
They're not from Rwanda, they're from Congo.
They're from Congo.
And they're supposedly,
from Congo.
They're supposedly warring these people from Rwanda. Are they then going to be sent to Rwanda if they came here on a crossing?
From
Congo? Yeah.
Would people be sent from Well, I mean, Rwanda is a different country of Congo, isn't it? It's a different country.
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
Definitely.
So you're saying if they come from a war zone in Congo, would they then be sent to Rwanda? That's the point he's making.
So there is a clause in the legislation that says if somebody would suffer, I think the phrase is serious and irreversible harm by being sent somewhere, they wouldn't be sent. So there is that safety mechanism built into the legislation.
You know, sometimes I think it's jarring when sort of a politician is caught out on sort of a gap in factual knowledge. You know, being a politician is not doing a pub quiz. You know, so when someone says, "Do you know the capital city of this country? Do you know precisely how many police officers there are in this city?" You know, sort of things like that. You think, well, maybe this isn't how we should do politics. But knowing that Congo and Rwanda are different countries, that's pretty basic. Especially as the questioner said, "I'm from Congo, a country which neighbors Rwanda." And then the guy says, "Oh, Congo and Rwanda are different countries?" And you could see from the reaction of the audience and the reaction of the panel that no one was like, you know, that was bizarre. Aaron, what did you make of that clip from Question Time?
Oh, it's an indictment on the British education system, isn't it? Christ. My dad, as I love to say, let me do my Sadiq Khan impression, Michael. My dad's a taxi driver. He's an Iranian taxi driver. And he knows loads of taxi drivers, Turks, Afghans, Iranians. None of these people have a degree, or very few of them have a degree. They all know that Congo and Rwanda aren't the same country. Partly because Rwanda, of course, was in the news for all the wrong reasons in the 1990s. Also, the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire, is a huge country. You know, it's a huge country. I mean, Kinshasa is going to be one of the world's largest cities in a couple of decades. Congo's population is going to be enormous. I mean, it's a geographically massive country as well. If you have a political class that doesn't know the difference between Rwanda and Congo, a country which is really going to be very important in terms of resources, in terms of demographic growth, in terms of geopolitics, you're in trouble. I suspect most Chinese politicians of a rank broadly commensurate with Chris Phipps would know the difference. I think most French, German, Italian, I mean, I could be completely wrong, Michael. Most Russian politicians. It says definitely not most American politicians. And so the fact that Chris Phipps is more closely aligned to his US counterparts than the rest of the world is worrying. I always find him quite amusing as a character because he looks like Patrick Bateman. So maybe Chris Phipps has been spending too much time on his morning skincare routine and his stomach crunches than his geography. I agree that, look, general knowledge is not a prerequisite to being a good legislator. Of course, it's not. I mean, it might help, but it's not a prerequisite. But this is utterly ridiculous. You know, there could be a reshuffle and the gentleman's working for the Foreign Office or an international aid. Of course, they're both in the same department now. Or he could be working with the MOD. You need to know this stuff. Absolutely astonishing. But sadly, Michael, that is the caliber of many, many MPs. The caliber of MPs amongst the Tory benches is very low. A lot of Labour MPs aren't that much better. I mean, they would get that right, okay? But they're not great. We're not sending our best people, Michael, as somebody famously said across the water in the US.
Now, I like your answer because alongside the question from the audience member on Question Time, you allow me to draw a distinction between knowledge which it's sort of useful to remember and knowledge which it's not. So knowledge which is useful to remember is that Rwanda and Congo are different countries and they're next to each other. Knowledge which it's not so useful to remember is Chris Philps' name. So the audience member on Question Time said, "What's that guy's name? Chris?" And you've been calling him Chris Phipps all section. But I don't think that's a problem. I don't think Chris Philps really deserves to have his name remembered properly if he can't even do the duty of remembering two large countries. Well, Rwanda's very small, but one large country, one very famous country in Africa. GB News has been back in the news this week. That's in part because its founding chair, Andrew Neil, has been speaking to MPs in Parliament.
What I didn't want it to become, I could see it was happening, which is why I left almost immediately, was an outlet for bizarre conspiracy theories or anti-vaxxers or basically the nutty end of politics. That's
Fox
not
News.
Which Fox News is, I say, very good in quotes at. And in America, there's a bigger market for that. There's no market in Britain beyond a hardcore of nutters. Am I allowed to say nutters? I just said nutters.
So is the outlook for GB News, as far as you're concerned, fairly gloomy? Not just because because they got the model wrong.
I need to be careful what I say here because I'm quite surprised that GB News has survived as long as it is. And I'm even more surprised that it sold off Talk TV. I actually thought Talk TV might do real damage to GB News because it did have better production values. And it wasn't so conspiracy theory. It had a variety. Yeah, I think it did kind of lean to the right, but it had a variety of opinions, and they weren't all to the right. I think GB News has found, to my surprise, it's found a niche for itself, but it's not a very big niche, and it's not a niche that can ever be profitable.
Now, whether GB News' niche can ever be profitable is up for debate, but what's already clear is it's shedding money in the here and now. Since launching, GB News has made losses of £76 million. And that poses this question: what's in it for those investing in GB News whose money is subsidising the channel? Well, on that front, Prospect magazine has an interesting profile in its most recent edition. It's about Paul Marshall, who is GB News' biggest individual investor. Paul Marshall is a somewhat peculiar character. So after leaving university, he became a research assistant to future Lib Dem leader Charles Kennedy. And in the late 2000s, he co-edited the Orange Book, which is a plea for the Lib Dems to embrace free markets. But he left the party over Brexit and began donating to the Tories. Quite the sort of transition. He's also very rich. So he's amassed £800 million as owner of a hedge fund. So why has Paul Marshall spent so much of that cash on GB News? Well, according to Prospect, it's not so much his politics, but rather his religious faith that's motivated the decision. Marshall is a key player in the Holy Trinity Church, or HTB, which is known both for its wealthy members and its somewhat fundamentalist beliefs. So Prospect writes this: HTB is the home of the Evangelistic Alpha Course and a center of the charismatic church movement. Charismatic Christians believe that God intervenes personally in their lives through direct encounters with the Holy Spirit, sometimes in the form of ecstatic experiences. They may believe that God's approval is expressed in their increasing numbers, wealth, and influence. Over recent decades, HTB's impact has extended into every corner of the Church of England. Marshall has invested heavily in the Holy Trinity Church, just sort of their charitable associations and also sort of to the churches themselves. He's also the founder of the ARC group of academy schools. They're in sort of lots of inner cities, including in London. And on the media side, he started Unheard magazine. And as we've said, he's the main individual funder of GB News. Now, of that, Prospect writes this: all of this stems from Marshall's powerful sense that he has been called by God for such a time as this, to quote the phrase from the Book of Esther, much cited by evangelical culture warriors. He contends that liberalism has lost its moorings by cutting itself off from its Christian origins. He believes that large parts of the leadership of the church have fallen captive to what his friend Gove, so that's Michael Gove, speaking in a broader context, has called the resentment industry. But in evangelical theology, attacks, whether from outside or inside the church, are to be expected. In fact, they are a sign that God is at work. They go on. Marshall's latest reform project is the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. Its glitzy inaugural conference, attended by 1,500 people last November, culminated with a keynote speech from Jordan Peterson in the O2. This arc is crewed by right-wing politicians, activists, and influencers whose aim is to repair what their research describes as the fraying of the social fabric. While not explicitly religious, it is clear that faith, in its Judeo-Christian expression, underpins the enterprise. Aaron, I found this sort of article in Prospect very interesting because I think, I often assume, and I think, more often than not, it potentially is correct, that people who buy up sort of media organizations, their principal interest is for their class, their class interests. So you buy something like GB News or Fox News, and what you really want is low taxes. But you know that you can't sort of make a successful channel which is just telling people that low taxes are good. So you have to make a successful channel, which is sort of spouting culture wars stuff. So talking about migration, talking about traditional values, talking about LGBT people. But you're really doing that because that sort of draws people in who then sort of you can get to vote for the party that supports low tax. And I think there's I always have this sort of rational calculation model going on in my head. But I suppose if this article is to be believed, it doesn't seem to be about money. It seems to be about religion. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, ideology has played a huge role for many people over the centuries, Michael, in terms of politics. I mean, it was overtly centre stage for most of the 20th century, between 1945 and 1990 in European politics. And of course, nationalism is a set of ideas, and that's also driven many people in both the global north and global south for a very long time. So, this is not the exception. But like you say, in terms of newspaper ownership, which he's looking to enter with the Telegraph, for instance, or media ownership generally in the UK, it's unusual. Owning a media outlet which is losing money is not unusual. The Sun over the last 3 years has lost around £200 million. I think there was an FT article in 2021 where Rupert Murdoch had written its effective value down to zero because it has so many liabilities, has to pay so much money out to people with regards to various legal cases and whatnot. So the Sun is still a continuing operation because Murdoch likes the fact it has, as you've said, Michael, political influence. It's not about making money. And I found Andrew Neil's testimony there, by the way, rather strange. I found the whole thing rather strange because, Paul Marshall doesn't want to make money with this. Like you say, I think he'd not want to lose much money. I don't think he wants to lose £40 million a year, and I don't think that could carry on for very long. But I think there probably is a number in his head where he thinks, well, if we lose £10 million a year, great. Especially if it's having a massive impact on the Tory party. So that would be my sort of two bobs worth. I think they've just announced a waiver of redundancies. They are growing. They will be thinking we need to do audience capture and then probably scale back our costs. And that's what they're doing. Can they go from 40 million to 20 million lost? I think probably. But can they go from that to 10 million? The guy's worth hundreds of millions of pounds. It's not really a major issue for him. If it's a massive asset in terms of influencing national politics, I don't think he'd mind. So that is one thing. Secondly, Andrew Neil himself has been involved in so many failed media outlets. It's unbelievable. He was the editor of the European newspaper, ended. He was the editor of the business newspaper, ended. And his criticism of Fox News, he worked for Rupert Murdoch on Fox News in the early 1990s after the Sunday Times. He went to the US to work on building Fox News. The man is just is weird. I find Andrew Neil a very fascinating character in a way. This is somebody who he was a centre-right conservative who was pro-European, pro-EU, and then he got on the Brexit train. I mean, like I say, he literally edited a newspaper called The European. He believed in the EU as this massive free market of hundreds of millions of people. I think, like with many of these people, Michael, he didn't really believe in that much. He believed in getting rich. He believed in status, and he believed in being quite, a popular guy, a popularity contest winner on TV, having a bit of a laugh on BBC This Week. But I don't think he actually believes in that much fundamentally. He identified as being to the right of Thatcher, by the way, in the 1980s, Andrew Neil, when working at the Sunday Times. So some of his criticisms I would take with a pinch of salt. Also, his vision for what GB News should be, by the way, I don't think it can make money. I think news TV in this country can't make money generally, no matter how good it is. The point is how much are you willing to lose? His vision of GB News also wasn't going to make money. I mean, Talk TV hasn't made money. Sky News doesn't make money. Sky News loses a ton of money. Obviously, you've got BBC News, which is paid through the license fee. It's different. The Channel 4 News requires public funds. ITV requires public funds. This stuff doesn't make money. So, yeah, the criticisms from Andrew Neil, I think he's like a jilted ex. And I think there's just loads of historic inconsistencies in terms of what he's saying. In terms of Paul Marshall, again, interesting, fascinating character for all the wrong reasons. I think he's responsible for training like a third of the priests in this country now, Michael, or a third of the Anglican priests, the Protestant priests. I don't know. The huge figure. There was a write-up about him in the FT not so long ago. What I do find compelling in a way, Michael, and I think this should be an inspiration for progressive or left-wing people in business or who've done very well, is that they should get behind the things they care about. If you care about climate change, you should fund people that are doing stuff on climate change, journalism, activism, business models, new products, whatever. I might not agree with half of it, but the point is he's putting his money where his mouth is. And that is unusual in the UK. It's not unusual in the US. And I wonder, will that be something of a precedent for people in the UK? Will we have more people on the sort of progressive liberal end of politics do likewise? You see a little bit of that, say, with the New European. Historically, they've not felt the need to get involved in politics because, of course, you have the BBC. The BBC is centrist, it's socially liberal, but it's also economically liberal, but it encompasses a broad range of views. So they never felt compelled to get into broadcast, but maybe Paul Marshall is opening the stable door in that regard. So hugely interesting. I think really this is a call to arms for people to fund the media that they care about. And of course, if you feel that way, you should support Novara Media, because this stuff is not going away. The Christian aspect to all of it, finally, Michael, is unusual. And I think, frankly, unless he has a very long-term project in mind, 40, 50, 60 years, he's not going to get very far with it. If you look at the people who bring in the audience for GB News, Farage, Michelle Dewberry, these aren't people, Dan Wootton, these aren't people you associate. No, maybe they are religious, but these aren't people you associate with evangelical Christianity. And in fact, their audience, hitherto, let's say, older Brits in primarily post-industrial places outside of major cities, particularly outside of the southeast, those people are actually less religious than London. And I find this fascinating. People talk about, the metropolitan elite, their secular values. London is more religious than the rest of the country because it's younger. And of course, it has recent migrants and their children coming from elsewhere, whether that's evangelical Christians, Haredi Jews, Muslims, who are more religious than the median Brit. So I find his project a strange one in many ways. I think he's going to waste a significant amount of money. But I do think he'll be a huge player in reshaping the Conservative Party after any defeat, whether that's this year or early next year.
And he's trying to be an even bigger player. So we've got some more news on Paul Marshall just from today. So he has stepped down from the board of GB News, and he's been replaced by the Tory peer Lord Agnew. He's been clear, though, he will still have a lot of involvement in GB News because he's still the biggest investor. So as the de facto owner, you still have a lot of influence, even if you're not formally sitting on the board. And the reason apparently that he has stood down from the board, from that sort of more day-to-day management, is because he's bidding for the Spectator and the Telegraph. So if you've got GB News, the Spectator and the Telegraph, then you essentially control the Conservative Party. You don't have to be that rich to control a political party in this country. It's very, very interesting. I am sort of surprised that there hasn't been a sort of liberal billionaire come in and set up their own TV channel. It might actually be the case that Sky News, I think, is owned by the Disney Channel or sort of a bit of a faceless American organization. And they're I think when they bought it, they sort of guaranteed that Sky News would keep going for X number of years because they also wanted the other assets that come with it. So I could imagine that if they ended up sort of going up for sale, you could have some liberal billionaire sort of swoop in and have a more liberal version of GB News, a sort of MSNBC type channel. Obviously, it wouldn't be doing class war, and it probably wouldn't be that good on Palestine, but it wouldn't be sort of putting forward anti-climate conspiracy theories in the way that Fox News or sometimes GB News does too. Let's wrap up there. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
My pleasure, Michael. You know what? One final thought is that somebody's already doing that, Michael. Their name is Gary Lineker, and they run the most successful podcast empire in the UK. And he's exactly the politics you're talking about, sort of liberal MSNBC type. But anyway, we could talk about this all day. Thanks, Michael. Great show. I wish all our viewers and listeners a wonderful weekend.
I would just add to that, I think Gary Lineker makes lots of money from that podcast channel. So Goalposts, is it Goal Hanger News. I can't have that confirmed, but I would imagine he would, because making podcasts is very cheap. Their listenership is huge. So I'm talking about a billionaire who wants to sink loads of cash into a loss-making organization. But anyway, we'll come back to this. Thank you all for tuning in this evening. Come back on Monday for another stream. Have a fantastic weekend. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.